Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex MacIsaac, and today I'll be presenting my capstone project titled Minor Oversight: Why Canada Must Reform Digital Privacy for Minors. Canada has no federal laws or regulations that specifically protect minors and children in digital spaces. The United States does, the European Union does, and some countries like the UK just expanded their child privacy regulations even further. But Canada has nothing. When I learned about this enormous regulatory gap, I honestly couldn't believe it. Children and minors are less able to understand data and privacy concerns compared to adults, and children could be subject to harmful manipulation and exploitation as a result of our lax privacy regulations. So today, I'll lay out my case for why Canada so desperately needs new and expanded privacy reform, focusing on minors and children. And I'll provide recommendations on how the federal government should react. But first, I'll need to define some terms for clarification. Today, I'll be frequently referring to both children and minors, which are two connected but separate terms. Defining what age children are and what age minors are is difficult in a Canadian context. Age of majority is set by provinces and territories, and they don't all agree on the definitions. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be using the most common Canadian definition of a minor, that being people under the age of 18 or 19 years old. Defining children is slightly more difficult. Most jurisdictions define the cutoff of childhood to be somewhere between the ages of 13 and 16 years old. I don't claim to know where this boundary should be set for Canadians, but I want to ensure that you, the audience, understand the difference between minors and children. All children are minors, but not all minors are children. Non-child minors, i.e. teenagers, have more autonomy than children do, but are still not yet legal adults. And thus, they'll require different privacy-related considerations. So first, the question of consent. Can a minor give meaningful consent to have their data collected? Can they adequately understand the concept of data or where their information is going? I'd answer by saying, well, it depends. Can a 7-year-old understand what consenting to data collection means? Probably not. But can a 16-year-old? Probably, maybe. Again, I'm not advocating for a specific age here, but a solution to part of this problem will need to be setting an age cutoff somewhere by law. However, many of the complex problems around digital privacy reform are design problems rather than legal problems. Legal gates can control how services operate, but they can't control minors' behavior. Why? Because children can just lie about their age. It's really easy to do online. And thus, children bypass legally enforced age gates all the time. Over 40% of American children aged 9 to 12 reported that they regularly use Instagram, even though the platform requires users to be at least 13 years old. This is an example of why legal boundaries alone won't be enough. A combination of both legal and service design regulations will be necessary. Now, children are also being exploited for financial gain through their data, even in really sneaky ways, through wearable devices, internet-connected toys, and other tech. They use minors as a data source. Some scholars have argued that due to this data exploitation of children, it's the first time since child labor law reform that children's activities were of substantial economic value. And also, big tech companies aren't the only ones surveilling their children. Parents and guardians are surveilling their own children with or without their child's knowledge and consent, using nanny cams, GPS software, or through remotely controlling their children's personal devices. A growing number of parents are disregarding their children's privacy and excessively monitoring their digital and physical activities. Now, child psychologists argue that these practices can normalize the erosion of personal privacy and could deprive children of personal autonomy and independence. Now, these are just a handful of many present privacy problems in online spaces, but all of them will require complex solutions. Now, onto the current state of Canadian privacy regulation. Canada's federal privacy regulation is called PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Document Act. Now, nowhere in this act is it defined how or if the privacy of minors and children should be considered any differently than that of an adult. Within Canadian data privacy law, digital service providers can treat the data of a 5-year-old and a 50-year-old identically. And the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada confirms this, to quote, "While the Act does not differentiate between adults on the one hand and youth on the other, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, or OPC, has consistently viewed personal information relating to youth and children as being of particular sensitivity, especially the younger they are, and that any collection, use, or disclosure of such information must be done with this in mind." So here, the OPC is merely suggesting how digital service providers should act, not how they must. Right now, as it stands, digital norms and the goodwill of platforms are the only protections that exist to defend the privacy of minors in Canada online. But the federal government has been trying to update our privacy legislation for some time. In 2020, Bill C-11 was considered and discussed in Parliament, and it aimed to amend PIPEDA and reform consumer data privacy regulations. Now, it wasn't passed, and we've since had an election, so this bill was left in limbo, but notably, nowhere in this bill were the privacy considerations of minors and children considered or discussed. Although digital privacy reform has been on the table, it seems that minors' protections are not on the federal government's mind. So with the federal government failing to update national privacy legislations, some provinces have stepped up. In Canada, federal and provincial governments have equal regulatory authority over privacy. So last year, Quebec enacted Bill 64, a privacy act that does actually target children. The act made it illegal for online services to collect children's data without parental consent. And meanwhile, provinces like Ontario, BC, and Alberta are all reconsidering their own privacy acts and potentially looking to expand minors' privacy regulations as well. Now, to contrast Canada's lack of regulation, I'll discuss 3 jurisdictions' attempts at targeting this policy problem. Back in 2000, the United States put the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, into law. And COPPA requires that online services obtain verifiable parental consent before personal data is collected from children, much like Quebec's Bill 64. At the time, this legislation fundamentally changed the way that online services could operate. This was a first of its kind legislation. And services now had to ask users for their age online. Now, the interesting problem with COPPA is actually that, though, age. Somewhat arbitrarily, US lawmakers decided that, in the context of COPPA, children could be defined as persons aged 12 and younger. In recent years, this age definition has been brought up as a flaw. 13 to 17-year-olds aren't adults, they're teenagers. So why, in a digital context, are they treated identically to adults? Should we not have more measured protections for adolescents? In 2018, the European Union adopted the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Like COPPA, it requires guardians to give consent before children's data is processed. But the GDPR allows its EU member states to set their own definitions for what age defines a child versus a non-child, but within limits. Interestingly, the regulation sets the default defined age of a child being anyone younger than the age of 16. However, member states are allowed to lower this age to as low as anyone younger than 13 years old, the same as the US's definition. 2/3 of member states have elected to lower the age in some way, and 1/3 lowered it all the way to 13. And then last year, the United Kingdom instituted the Children's Code, which originally went by the more descriptive name, the Age Appropriate Design Code. The code's a series of guidelines that informs digital services that are accessible to children how they must design their platforms. It's divided into 15 design standards that cover topics of privacy, harmful content, and online safety. By creating product design guidelines, along with existing law, the UK government allows digital service providers to interpret the code themselves and develop their own solutions, making this type of regulation a more open and almost collaborative approach between government and the private sector, compared to other firm legal regulations. However, firms that are willfully non-compliant with the code are subject to an enormous fine of 4% of their global revenue. So there is significant recourse available. Now, the success of the Children's Code in the UK has actually helped inspire other jurisdictions. Similar child-focused design codes have been proposed and are being considered in Ireland, Australia, and California this year. So, with privacy harms, the Canadian context, and these international examples in mind, what should our federal government do to help solve this policy problem? First, I believe we need to set age definitions for what constitutes a minor and what constitutes a child within digital privacy legislation, although provincial governments likely get the final say here. Thus, I recommend taking a page from the GDPR by having the federal government set a maximum and minimum age definition threshold for both minors and children, allowing provinces to choose their own defined ages, but within limits. With these new definitions, I then recommend that the federal government put into Canadian privacy law that children's data cannot be legally collected by digital service providers without parental consent. As I discussed earlier, this is a bit of a blunt policy instrument, but it sets a legal precedent and is only one of many actions to help fix the informed consent problem. Secondly, Canada should follow in the path of the UK by adopting an age-appropriate design code. For example, this type of code could ensure that all data privacy settings must default to the strictest measures for new users, or that digital services must allow users the right to be forgotten, the right to have their data permanently removed from a platform, or that services must notify minors if they're being surveilled, even if it's by their own parents. This is also where the legal distinction of children versus minors comes into play. Aspects of this design code should reference how services should be designed in the different contexts of both children and non-child minors. A design code can also help with other social problems regarding youth in digital spaces, including harmful content, moderation, and online safety. Through adopting a design code, we can attempt to rein in these difficult problems while allowing digital service providers to come up with their own solutions. We can provide guidelines for services while still having some teeth to enforce the code with. Like the UK, Canada should find services that are willfully non-compliant with the design code. Although regulators will have to undoubtedly collaborate on enforcing such a code, Canada will need a primary regulatory body to monitor these data-specific issues, which brings me to my final recommendation. Canada should appoint a federal data commissioner to oversee these data-related privacy issues, mirroring the regulatory structure already established in both the EU and the UK. Over the past 3 years, our Prime Minister has mentioned appointing a federal data commissioner multiple times.
Alex, thank you. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. You are just over 12 minutes. Could you please wrap as quickly as you can so we can get to questions? Sorry to interrupt.
Of course. No worries. I'll be done in the next 30 seconds. This type of regulator will likely be established along with new privacy regulations anyways, but they should take responsibility for enforcing Canadian age-appropriate design code, a Canadian age-appropriate design code if implemented. So what's next for Canada? Canadian federal privacy legislation is likely going to be discussed again in Parliament, probably very soon. Last time, minors and children were not considered at all. If Canada is going to perform a comprehensive update of its privacy legislation, for it to be truly comprehensive, the needs of Canadian minors and children must be considered. Compared to our international peers, Canada has very little protection for the privacy of minors' data. But our federal government is going to have the ability to change that, and I hope they do soon. Thanks for listening, and that concludes my capstone presentation today.